All right, then. Good evening. I am Bill Blair. I'm the director of the Richard Civil War Era Center, editor of Journal of the Civil War Era, and co-sponsor of this event. And frankly, it is truly the realization of a dream to see this happening today. Last night, Frank Towers gave you his side of the story of the history of this event. I thought I'd tell you about mine, especially because Frank reminded me that I guess I'm the guy who said that we should turn into Judy Garland and Mickey Rooney and put on a show. And here it is, 3 years later. So it was actually many years ago for me, about 2007 or 8, thereabouts, that my colleague Mark Neely and I were actually wondering how it would look to change the international studies of the war from the traditional East-West axis that involved Europe, which is a synonym for England, and instead try to get a north-south axis that brought new players to the table. We both felt that something was missing from understanding where the American Civil War fit within a broader world movement. And when I started the Journal of the Civil War Era, that was really on my mind as we tried to expand the ways in which we thought about the war and the era. Patrick J. Kelly came along and he showed us some of the potential in realigning our thinking in his very thoughtful piece, The North American Crisis of the 1860s, which appeared in the September 2012 issue of the Journal. Well, Pat had picked up on earlier work, including that of Canadian historian W.L. Morton, whose name keeps getting bandied about these days, who argued that the U.S. Civil War was, quote, the central and decisive feature of the crisis that disturbed the whole continent of North America in 1861, unquote. Well, that seemed all well and good, but it perhaps did not do justice to Mexico, a subject that was more immediately on Pat's mind, and there was certainly a central concern of the United States and the European powers who were vying for hegemony in the hemisphere. But Pat got me started in trying to see how we should push toward a hemispheric look in the struggle between monarchy and republicanism, as well as the attendant economic, labor, and governmental systems employed in the struggles for empire. We're borrowing from historians like Jack P. Green, who advocated for a continental perspective in order to bring the West and indigenous people into the stories of Atlantic history. Pat, I thought, did a really good job of suggesting how Mexico gave us a greater sense of conflicts among a greater range of people across space and time. But I have to admit that back in 2012, just before I got together with Frank, I really had the same question that came up during the discussion period last night, which was, what about Canada? Does it really belong in the mix? But I also knew that Canada was in some ways instrumental in the American Civil War. And I've been suddenly becoming more aware of how porous boundaries were, especially for people and materiel, but how rigid they were when it came to autonomy, sovereignty, and legal issues. For example, you may or may not know that white Americans, white US citizens, used the Canadian border back in the Civil War, just like we did during the Vietnam era. There's a dissertation that has never been published, and I'm sad it hasn't, but it was done in 1974 by Robert Sterling, called Civil War Draft Resistance in the Middle West. And in there, he claimed that 90,000 United States citizens, encouraged at first by the Canadian government because of a labor shortage, yeah, that happens, left the country for Canada in order to avoid the draft. Sound familiar? That may, I don't know if anybody's done the comparison, but that may be as much or more than during the Vietnam era. I do not honestly know if that figure stands up to scrutiny, but I know that nobody has ever even tried to pick up on it since then. Nor do I know the extent of involvement by Afro-Canadians in the U.S. Civil War, those who had established refugee communities in Canada, although one of our papers suggests that perhaps a couple of thousand came back to fight for the Union. But as for the status of that community and the other black communities in Canada and whether its people had to struggle for equality, I really have no clue. I also know that Canada provided, as we heard from Bo Cleland today, it provided a safe harbor for Confederate terrorist operations. The Confederate government drafted former Secretary of the Interior, Jacob Thompson, to take gold, precious gold for the Confederacy, and try to use it to support plots, freeing perhaps prisoners of war behind Union lines, and shoving arms into their hands in order to create mayhem in the rear of the Union Army. Agents of the Confederacy crossed the border and attacked and robbed banks in Vermont. And agents of the Confederacy, operating from Canada, placed Greek fire in 5 New York City hotels in an attempt to commit an act of terrorism. It did not succeed. They didn't know enough about how to really use it. But they tried to create an act of terrorism they hoped would actually influence the 1864 presidential election. And then there were the Fenians, the Irish radicals who hoped to strike at the British Empire through its American holdings, and who hoped to do so and did so to an extent with Irish Americans whom they wanted to help bring along this struggle. Well, knowing all this, and knowing the limits of my knowledge too, I kept wondering how Canada fit within this story, this continental crisis, and frankly, I had no idea of how to move forward. And then Frank Towers enters the picture. We were at, as he remembers, and I think it's right, at the 2012 conference of the Society of Civil War Historians in Lexington, Kentucky. It was a beautiful setting. And Frank cornered me, and I think at the time he was just talking about, he was struggling with some of these notions as well, and he knew others who were trying to figure their way through these particular issues. And as you heard him last night, he said he came and he gave me a pitch. Well, I have to tell you, he didn't really have to make much of a pitch. He had me at hello. And I think, honestly, this is a great time. You know, we've all thanked Frank individually. Every panelist has done it. But I think right here in this kind of major setting, we should give him and his colleagues a huge round of applause. And it was Frank and his colleagues who helped not only shape the intellectual content, but helped shape this particular program. But this brings me to now, to 3 years later, after that meeting, and I stand here presiding over a panel with no title, just the ambiguous designation of keynote number 2. That's who we are, the sequel. Okay. I do think, however, that's appropriate to be the panel with no name, because honestly, we might not have a name yet. The part of what we're trying to do here is figure out where do we go, what should we call it, and where do we go next? So thank you, Frank, for not naming this panel.
My lack of creativity paid off.
But I do assure you that after seeing the papers, that this is going to be a great session. We have great people who are going to make us think differently and productively, maybe not about Canada in this particular case, but the US and Mexico and the struggles for sovereignty in those countries. So tonight we'll start off with Erika Pani. She is a research professor and chair of El Colegio de Mexico, and she teaches and writes there on Mexican politics during the long 19th century. I've enjoyed talking with her over the past 2 days, finding that we have some common strands of thought, especially about the use of treason and executions. So a little bit grim, but it's okay. She has published, and I apologize, I qualified in German during my graduate days, so I'm going to do this in English. She has published on the political projects of Maximilian's Mexican Collaborators in 2001, and in 2015 on naturalization laws and practices in the 19th century. She also edited on Mexican conservatism in 2009 and co-edited on the decade of the 1860s in 2013. I think we're all going to benefit from what she's going to say here tonight.
Thank you, Bill. And I also want to thank Frank and Matt and Barbie for bringing me to the far north to join this fascinating conversation. And I want to thank all of you who have eaten and drunk and are going to have to be a little patient with keynote number 2. I find the 1860s fascinating because of the eclectic and undogmatic political experiments that took place during this decade, not only in North America, but throughout. I can almost say the world if we think of Meiji Japan. New nations were founded. Napoleon III established an empire on the premise that universal suffrage and authoritarian government were not only compatible, but mutually reinforcing. And foreign princes were called to rule over nationalist and in some aspect progressive regimes. War reshuffled possibilities for groups like the Great Plains Indians, which Pekka will brilliantly describe when I'm done, but also for the Opata de Mayos, the Coras in Mexico, and the Parisian communards, and later the Spanish cantonalistas who imagined republics of working men and women who would govern from free municipalities. The decade that followed is one of narrowing political possibilities. The hegemonic model of the nation state, and I think our plenary session of this morning should remind us that it was only a model, becomes the way to go. That's the way that politicians think we should organized politically in this, what Charles Meyer has described as bordered political space and spatially anchored structures for economics and politics. What I think we see in this process is a revolution in the meaning of sovereignty. Sovereignty turning into something broader, more pervasive, and more sweeping than it was before in people's imaginations, and that this transformed North America. The basic political structures of the 3 nation states that occupy it today were settled, even if it was only in politicians' wishful thinking. For the case of Mexico, if we're thinking of a nation state with its national market and a national population, it can count, tax, and mobilize. In the case of Mexico, I think it's clear in the minds of both imperial and Republican politicians in the 1860s, but the first census doesn't take place until the 1895. The state taxes that are set on the circulation of goods are abolished in 1858, but don't disappear until 1896. So I think this gives us an idea of what they wanted to do and when they were able to do it. So what I want to do this evening is explore this transformation and how it affected the way political allegiance and membership in the national community were conceived and enforced during this critical period, which I would argue for Mexico starts earlier. I think it's the war, the end of the war with the states, which really gets it going, as Mexico is torn between 2 contending political projects. In 1848, a despondent politician, Mariano Otero, wrote that Mexico had lost the war and half its territory to the United States because it was not a nation. It lacked the common interests and the affections of the heart that would have united its inhabitants in its defense. In the aftermath of this painful and costly defeat, the task of warranting the stable political regime that had eluded the young nation since independence took on greater urgency. In 1853, conservative politicians set up a dictatorial regime headed by military strongman and frequent president Antonio López de Santana, believing that order strictly enforced, the rule of law, rational administration, and the eradication of politics would guarantee political stability and growing prosperity. Widespread opposition toppled Santana's last government in October of 1855, and a group of young liberals came to the fore of national politics. They drafted a constitution which they hoped would destroy the colonial legacies that had obstructed the young nation's path to progress. They also sought to lay the foundations of a more solid, legitimate relationship between the citizen and the national government in order to create those common interests and affections that the nation sorely lacked. Before the self-proclaimed Ayutla Revolution brought down Santana, Mexican constitutions had dealt mostly with the relationship between different centers of power within a framework of representative government. In the wake of an authoritarian centralizing dictatorship, the 1856 Constituent Congress sought to reestablish both federalism and democracy. But it also hoped to define not only to define the organization, reach, and limitations of the federal authority. It also wanted to transform Mexican society by invigorating its stagnant economy, curtailing the church's power, wealth, and influence, and elevating all of the patria's children to the moral dignity of the citizen. The halls of Congress resonated with the language of social emancipation, redolent of that of the 1848 revolutions. The people's representatives wanted to liberate the unhappy peasants and artisans who were mere passive instruments of production, benefiting only the capitalist. They claimed their democratic constitution would be a sham, an expression of sarcasm, if the rights of the poor did not go beyond mere description. Despite this impassioned rhetoric, the basis of membership they set up for the new republic were more complex than is suggested by these visions of egalitarianism and redemption. All legal privilege and special jurisdictions, what was known as the fueros, were abolished in civil matters, but the Constitution made no effort to go beyond equality before the law. If the disentailment of corporately owned land that belonged to the church and in communities and municipal governments was meant to revitalize the sluggish land market and turn vulnerable day laborers into entrepreneurial property owners, the steps taken to prevent the concentration of property in the hands of the rich by favoring renters, by eliminating sales taxes on very small plots of land, etc., were insufficient, and later, in the midst of war, they would be put aside. As a policy, disentailment and eventually nationalization of church property benefited the moneyed elite, who had the cash and the government bonds needed to take advantage of the boom in the property market. In the realm of politics, the 1857 Constitution established practically universal suffrage. Having an honest way of living was the only restriction, but it was to be exercised indirectly. The men of 1856 believed apparently that elections, the supreme act of the sovereign, were something in which all citizens should participate, but not all could decide. The Constituent Congress also hailed the rights of man as the basis and objective of all social institutions. The drafting committee not only included a long and detailed Declaration of Rights, which is something Mexican constitutions had done since 1836, but established a mechanism to safeguard individual guarantees through the protection of federal courts. For a Congress which met in the wake of a triumphant revolution, whose members identified themselves, for all their differences, as liberals, politics played a surprisingly modest role in tracing the borders of the political community. Electoral law excluded members of the clergy from the right to vote, and a compact group of legislators tried to design election requirements in a way which favored the energetic Mexico City liberals against their usually more moderate provincial counterparts. But commitment to the defense of rights kept sidelining of political rivals to a minimum. The 1857 fundamental law even prescribed, as a first step towards its disappearance, the abolition of the death penalty for political offenses. Only those found guilty of treason in foreign war, highway robbery, arson, parricide, premeditated murder, and serious military offenses and piracy could be put to death. Unlike these generous and I would say consensual among the congressmen attitudes towards the criminalization of politics and the death penalty, the issue of religion would prove to be profoundly divisive, both within and without the walls of Congress. Many congressmen shied away from establishing freedom of religion, some because they thought that the freedom to be mistaken, and consequently burn in hell, had to be denied. Others, because they thought that in an overwhelmingly Catholic country, religious tolerance was useless, ill-timed, and dangerous. It would only fan and legitimize the fire of opposition. The numerous petitions that flowed into Congress were seen as proof of the unpopularity of religious toleration. Those whom the liberals hailed as the sovereign people, whose will was to constitute the foundation of governance, defended the very illiberal principle of religious intolerance. Consequently, the 1857 Constitution did not proclaim freedom of religion, but it was the first fundamental law that did not explicitly establish religious exclusivity. So the model of the Catholic Republic, which had been one of the central references for nation building since independence, was discreetly put aside. But the church in 19th century Mexico constituted more than a community of faith. It had provided a cultural matrix that molded perceptions and reactions and woven a web of norms and institutions which, for all its unevenness and sometimes contradictory nature, was more substantial than that of the state. Congress's efforts to lock up religion in church buildings and individual consciences could not be passed over quietly. Two conflicts brought about the breakdown of church-state relations. That was unleashed over the compulsory constitutional oath and that over the secularization of the crucial moments of the lives of men and women, birth, marriage, and death, with the creation of the civil registry. In March of 1857, the government ordered all public officials to swear, as had been the custom, to obey and uphold the new constitution. In 1857, in an atmosphere riddled with tension, Mexico's bishops warned that since the constitution was atheistic, ungodly, and consequently immoral and unjust, taking the oath was a grievous sin. The government required its employees to take the constitutional oath with God as their witness. The church promised to excommunicate those who did. It thus became impossible to be at the same time a good citizen and a good Catholic. The hierarchy's decision to deny the sacraments to those who supported the new order of things had consequences that went beyond the disquiet of individual consciences. Unless those swearing to uphold the Constitution or having bought up church land retracted, they could not be absolved, would not be able to take communion, or be buried in consecrated ground. They also would not be able to get married. Although some radical liberal couples took advantage of the sacrament's nature, so if you know, as you know, Catholic marriage, it's the spouses who are the ministers, so the couple would go into the parish priest's house, would be in bed, and would, very quickly say, I take you to be my lawful wedded husband, and they were actually married, and the priest would be in a horrible mood, but would have to accept that that a legitimate sacrament had taken place. The situation was untenable, even in a country with high legitimacy rates. The confrontation over marriage brought to the fore the corrosive nature of a secularization process structured by deep-seated conflicts over authority and legitimacy, and issues vital to the exercise of sovereignty, which basically I think boiled down in this case who could determine the nature of the Commonwealth, the justice of its laws, and its citizens' status. The anxieties, scandals, and clashes brought about by the dispute over the religious question fed into growing polarization and unrest. In December 1857, facing conspiracy and armed rebellion, and convinced that he could not govern with his constitution, President Ignacio Comonfort staged a coup d'etat, dissolved Congress, and suspended constitutional rule. Less than a month later, his government was toppled by the Mexico City troops commanded by Felix Zuluaga, who abolished the Constitution and sought to turn back the clock on its most radical innovations. Benito Juárez, who was president of the Supreme Court and had been governor of Oaxaca and the Minister of Justice, who had written the law that abolished fueros, took up the defense of the 1857 fundamental law. He set himself up as interim president in the port city of Veracruz. The professional army, conservative politicians, militant Catholics, and some regional strongmen, men like Tomás Mejía of the Sierra Gorda, Manuel Lozada in Nayarit, Miguel Negrete in Puebla, supported the Mexico City government. Liberals, some regional elites, and the newly formed National Guard rallied to the Constitution. The country, divided in two, collapsed into the most violent civil war since independence, which would last for almost a decade. During most of what the conservatives called the 3 Years' War and the liberals the War of Reform, so between 1858 and 1860, the Mexico City government dominated the more populous urban clerical center, but could not defeat the constitutionalists who had access to the national government's most important source of income, the Veracruz Custom House. Despite the good intentions expressed by the liberals during the recent constitutional debates, both governments relied on the law to construct, identify, and prosecute the nation's internal enemy. The same would happen during the French intervention and the Second Empire. Throughout a decade of conflict, two very similar sets of laws criminalized political opposition, expressed through seditious writings, spreading alarming rumors, trading with the enemy, refusing to take a loyalty oath, contesting a law, and taking up arms against the government. And it deemed dissidents to be treason. Perpetrators would be punished, often summarily, with fines, prison, forced conscription, exile, or death. The number and severity of these laws reflect the violence of war, but also the contenders' inefficacy, their failure to impose their rule by either force or persuasion. On the shifting ground of civil war, these laws interacted with local circumstances with unpredictable results. The war often fed into local disputes and fanned economic rivalries. According to some, in the midst of widespread unrest and talk of revolution, anti-ecclesiastical and communistic ideas were being bandied about, and they encouraged peasants to occupy lands and to disparage local religious and civil authorities. Men in position of authority, members of municipal council, local commanders, large landowners, priests, made use of these laws to invent baseless political crimes to get rid of their personal enemies. The best way to get rid of a rival, said Hacendado Amado Castillo, for instance, was to take up arms in defense of liberty and accuse him of being its enemy. Villagers argued dubious loyalty, suspicious association, and sometimes excessive good looks, audacity, and enlightenment to get rid of unpopular priests. On the ground, these draconian laws meant as weapons in a struggle against good and evil. Now, when these laws are drafted, they are meant to destroy an enemy who is the poison that will kill the country. On the ground, with people who have to deal with them and have to live their everyday lives in the meantime, these laws seem especially bewildering. Both the indicted and those charged with defending or judging them will draw up long lists of mitigating circumstances. Some argue that words and ideas, despite their subversive nature, cannot be penalized, as one will say, all are free to think. Others claim that in the midst of war, men are compelled to take up arms to perform public services against their will, and they do it because they're ignorant, they're poor, they're rustic, or they do it in self-defense. To explain and excuse themselves, men caught on an unstable wrong side contend that the rationality of their action lays beyond the rules of war. It follows the logic imposed by local circumstances, by the market, and by ties of family and friendship. The sway of a local cacique on a small town, a commercial transaction previously agreed on with no knowledge that it would benefit enemy armies, the instinct to protect a wife or a compadre despite their mistaken political inclinations. The contention that rules set by warring factions do not apply was taken up in 1867, albeit in a more sophisticated and erudite form, as the central argument in the defense of those who collaborated with the monarchical regime set up with the help of the invading French army. The lawyers in the trial of Maximilian and two of his generals, so the Indian cacique Tomas Mejia and the conservatives' so-called Young Maccabee, former President Miguel Miramon, repeatedly quote Emer de Vattel's conclusions about the impossibility of assigning responsibility to either party in a civil war, since the belligerent sides had no common superior on earth. Nevertheless, the military council's verdict of death denies that the violence which devastated the nation for 10 years has been the product of deep, pervasive divisions. Instead, they claim that the rebellion of a few bloodied the nation, which had steadfastly stood by the Constitution. But the reality of war is always messier. As both contenders sought to rally, intimidate, and discipline the populations, the liberals' construction of the church, or at least of part of the clergy, as the main culprit for a bloody and fratricidal war merits special attention. It is difficult to determine the church's degree of responsibility. Throughout the conflict, the bishops stood steadfast in their condemnation of the 1857 Constitution. Many of the first armed movements in 1856 and 1857 were no doubt instigated by men of the cloth in what has been dubbed the rebellion of the parish priests. Nonetheless, throughout the war, the episcopate's byword to the clergy was discretion. Priests were ordered to avoid scandal, to steer away from politics on the pulpit and in private conversation. You will imagine most of them were not very obedient, but this was the official church position. After a year and a half of war, the constitutionalist government, unable to break the stalemate, sought U.S. support and radicalized its political program in hope of bringing the conflict to an end. Its laws of reform centered exclusively on the church. In July 1859, it declared the most perfect independence between ecclesiastical matters and affairs of state. Church wealth was nationalized and religious orders were suppressed. Since the church, because of its greed and its dogmatism, had promoted prostitution and concubinage and had been stingy with its sacraments, the state took over those contracts which determined an individual's civil status. It secularized graveyards, instituted civil marriage and the civil registry. Law would determine the nature and the requirements of conjugal and family relationships. Those that fell outside its purview would lack legal validity. In December of 1860, the exhausted conservative army was defeated at Calpulalpan. The constitutionalist government returned to Mexico City in triumph, but the war was not over. Conservative forces sustained relentless guerrilla warfare, and most but not all would join the invading French army in early 1862 and rally to Maximilian's empire in 1864. In 1861, as the embattled republic sought to restore constitutional rule over a shattered community, and in the face of President Juarez's more conciliatory policies, the legislature opted for politics rather than law as the bond that would restore the nation's unity. The vanquished, it was argued, could not be considered simple political adversaries whose opinions and sincere convictions should be respected. They had to be excluded from any meaningful participation in the republic, and if possible, they would also have to be punished. Consequently, the standing army was disbanded, its most prominent generals placed beyond the pale of the law, with a price put on their heads. All bishops were ordered to leave the country. On the other hand, constitutional requirements for congressional elections were bent to include those who had defended the revolution, for, they said, talent and enlightenment cannot be sacrificed to legality. Projects for amnesty laws were discussed and rejected, while Congress voted for the temporary suspension of individual guarantees and emergency powers so that swift, untrammeled action could be taken to crush the conservatives. The decision taken by Congress, acting as a grand jury to determine the responsibility of those who had contributed to the December 1857 coup, is especially telling. Former governor of the federal district, Juan José Vaz, was exculpated, while Manuel Paino, who had been Minister of Finance and Comonfort's close collaborator, was found guilty. Vaz had sought to bring down constitutional rule in order to move forward, it was said. Paino had been under the influence of old ideas and wanted the Liberal Party to retreat. He and Comonfort had handed the situation over to the reactionaries. Vaz had been impatient, Paino had been scared, and he had made a mistake. Mistakes in politics, claimed fiery orator Ignacio Manuel Altamirano, were crimes, and one paid for crimes with one's head. Fortunately for Mexican literature, because those of you who know Manuel Paino know him as the author of that wonderful novel, Los Bandidos de Rio Frío, The Bandits of Rio Frío, the Supreme Court let him out on bail and did not sentence him, so he survived. The exile of Mexican bishops, the fate of Juan José Vaz and Manuel Paino, and that of Maximilian Miramón and Mejía speak to the failure of civil, rights-based community envisioned by the men of 1856, as it ran up against the resistance of those holding alternative visions of what the nation should be, and was perverted by the violence of a long, complicated civil war that bled into foreign invasion. When it was over, the restored republic, unlike what happened in 1861, made an effort to, as Juarez said, economize on blood. It insisted on the legitimacy of its war legislation, but used it sparingly, selectively, and strategically. Maximilian's execution was meant to send a clear message to an expansionist Europe. Its other victims included men on both sides of the political spectrum. So you have Miramon and Mejia on one hand. On the other hand, you have liberals, and I would say even a radical liberal like Santiago Vidaurri and someone like Tomás Ojoran. But they were men that the liberal regime found particularly irritating. Ultimately, the validity of the liberal republic's laws did not hinge on their popular origin or on their widespread acceptance or in their universal application, but on the republic's military triumph. The law would serve, as all laws do, as an instrument of political domination. Its role in structuring the national community was more arbitrary and more punitive than was hoped at first. So what does this process of the way the law is used to create treason and then its selective application to recreate, I would say, political community? What does it say about the way sovereignty was remade during this crucial decade? How does it fit into, I would say, the complex history of sovereignty in the New World, especially since independence? Now, when sovereignty goes from being the attribute of the king, and I would say essentially judicial in expression, the king intervened to give to each what was his or hers by right in the last instance, to the sovereignty of the nation, which is what makes independence legitimate. And how does this change throughout the first half of the 19th century, and especially during this decade? How do those conflicts over who was to exercise this national sovereignty at the local, at the state, or at the national level? And I would argue that what we see in the process of civil war and foreign intervention, and the way the laws of war try to structure this process, is sovereignty turning into something else. The efforts of both liberal and conservatives and imperialist government to command allegiance and compliance, the severity of these laws of war, I think, reflect a completely unrealistic idea of what laws do. They are rooted in desperation, but they are also rooted in the conviction that the nation's citizens' status, the virtuousness or treacherousness of their action, ultimately their membership in the political community, so the citizenship, belong by definition to the national state. It is the national state who can decide who belongs and what they do is right. The national state has the right to say what is right. And in those terms, I think that it is a much more powerful definition of sovereignty that can't necessarily become a reality, but that is what these politicians are thinking about. But I'd be very interested to see what you all have to say. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Before introducing the next speaker, the PowerPoint did not come through, but what we have done, if you have your mobiles or your computers or your tablets, whatever, you will be able to access the images or the PowerPoint by going to rnas.ca. rnas.ca. And there should be a PDF there, and if you open that up, you should be able to see some of the images that might be alluded to. Okay, so our next speaker is Pekka Hämäläinen. He is the Rhodes Professor of American History at Oxford University and a Fellow at St. Catherine's College. Previously, he was a Professor of History at the University of California in Santa Barbara, and he received his PhD from the University of Helsinki in 2001. His writings have appeared just about every place you would want to put your writings, in the American Historical Review, the Journal of American History, History and Theory, William and Mary Quarterly, and Western Historical Quarterly. My dean would be very happy with you. Happier still is the fact that his book, The Comanche Empire, published in 2008, received 12 book awards, including the Bancroft Prize, the Merrill Curdy Award, and the Coy Prize. He is also co-editor with Benjamin Johnson of Major Problems in the History of North American Borderlands and co-author of Liberty, Equality, Power, A History of the American People. Besides that, he is now the principal investigator of a 5-year project on nomadic empires in world history. You've been a busy guy. That is funded by the European Research Council. Please welcome to the podium Pekka Hämäläinen.
Yeah, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and also want to thank Frank for inviting me. It's a great honor. The history of the Civil War era it's in the midst of a Western turn. Its historians have begun to see the separation of the histories of the Civil War and the American West as an artificial divide. And they have revealed how similar forces simultaneously transformed the South and the West during and after the war. They've been, by any measure, widely successful. Many of us now think of the years between 1845 and 77 as Greater Reconstruction, a period defined by 3 wars: Mexican, Civil, and War against Native America. 3 wars that engendered a continental racial crisis and saw the extension of northern state power to the South and the West, and the dispossession of dozens of indigenous societies. And yet I would argue that the Western story of the Civil War era is far from complete. The current master story is a clash between North and South in the West. The West is a setting for an Eastern drama, and the Western Indians are caught in a violent storm that being brewed in another world. So I'm going to gesture for, this is time to click the next image there. So I'm just going to say image. Indeed, based on recent studies, the Western Indian story during the Civil War seems a series of massacres and atrocities. Bear River, Sand Creek, the Long Walk, and so on. Unprecedented violence fueled by toxic racism and inflicted by the suddenly swollen Union Army. The Civil War now appears a formative phase in a long history of Native American dispossession that both preceded and outlasted the war. In short, the histories of the Civil War, of the US Civil War, and the conquest of the American West are deeply intertwined. With the West in the frame, the Civil War America takes on a new meaning. As Ari Kelman has recently written, the Civil War now looks like a war of empire, a contest to control expansion into the West rather than a war of liberation. And yet, US empire building and Indian massacres do not define the Civil War era in the West. If we shift the focus from military operations to sovereignty and from battlefields to power dynamics on the ground, a more complicated picture begins to emerge. This picture is one of indigenous declension, but it's also one of indigenous resilience and power. Now, the West that matters here is the Great Plains, which in the mid-19th century became a setting for a bitter and prolonged clash between industrial East and nomadic West. If the clash between North and South was anticipated, this clash between East and West took most Americans by surprise, and that is what it made it so devastating. US policymakers had known about the plains, nomads, the Lakotas, Comanches, Cheyenne, and others since the Louisiana Purchase brought the Trans-Mississippi West into national consciousness. but they had largely ignored them, dismissing them as cultural relics, desperately out of step with modernity and therefore destined to vanish. Time would take care of the nomads, the reasoning went, freeing the Great Plains for settlement. It did not. The half a century following the Louisiana Purchase witnessed the consolidation of the Comanche Empire and Lakota conquest of the Northern Plains, and a general fluorescence of nomadic societies on the grasslands. The nomads were growing in numbers and expanding, fulfilling their visions of modernity. By the late 1840s, there were tens of thousands of them, living technically inside of US borders, but completely outside of US jurisdiction. Greater Reconstruction, as formulated by Elliott West, began with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which brought 80,000 Mexicans into US fold and triggered a prolonged Western racial crisis. I'd like to propose different coordinates and a different narrative arc for Greater Reconstruction. This is a story that begins with gold. The discovery of gold in California in 1848 galvanized the Americans and then gave them a pause. Between the Mississippi Valley and the distant gold fields, there was a vast sea of grass, filled with nomads who most manifestly were not vanishing. Seemingly atomized and constantly moving about on horseback, they seemed to be everywhere and nowhere, raiding, hunting, and hiding. Image. But they always seemed to be where they were where they were least wanted, along the river valleys that cut across the grasslands. Those river valleys had become crucial transportation conduits into California and Oregon, but they were also crucial for the plains nomads who needed the riverine resources, water, shelter, and grass for their own and their horses' survival. Violent clashes along the Platte and Arkansas rivers became commonplace, forcing the federal government to finally take notice of the nomads. If the ethnic composition of the Mexican cession alarmed and confused the federal agents, the nomadic condition of the Great Plains left them utterly baffled. The nomads were not only culturally inferior, they hailed from another world entirely, a world that should have passed long ago. The federal government simply did not know what to do with them. It didn't know how to negotiate over access and territory with people who didn't seem to have any concept of territoriality. And so the government drew on prior experience, relying on the same solution it had applied to Eastern Indians and to Mexico, a radical spatial rearrangement that supposedly suppressed thorny questions about ancestral rights or sovereignty. Next image. The result was two treaties, the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1851 and the Treaty of Fort Atkinson in 1853. Together, these two treaties, as Americans understood them, secured the safety of Oregon and Santa Fe trails by creating three distinct Indian colonies. One north of the Platte River, another south of the Arkansas, and a third in the Central Plains in between for the Cheyenne and Arapaho. Next image. Just like the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, these two treaties created conditions for a Western racial crisis that would simmer for decades. Desperate to guarantee free movement through the vast and menacing nomadic space, federal governments had recognized indigenous rights to vast stretches of land in exchange for rights of way. But that recognition was less about native rights than it was about state control. The nomads, the rational went, were now confined into bounded domains and pinned down. The arrangement began to break down almost immediately. The Indians, taken aback by the volume of the overland traffic, began to attack the immigrant trains and US Army patrols. And the Cheyenne and Arapaho, whose land skirted the Oregon and Santa Fe trails, went to war against the United States, challenging its authority through a rebellion that lasted a decade. Yet, as far as the federal government was concerned, the broad outlines of the Indian question in the Great Plains had been resolved. The rest would follow a familiar sequence. Native numbers would decline, settlers would come, new treaties would be made, and land would change hands. And so the federal government focused its energies elsewhere. That neglect would come to haunt it once the Civil War broke out, and it would haunt the United States long after the war had ended. When the Civil War erupted, the Union found itself entangled in two wars, one against Confederate South and the other against a nomadic West. The war made the Central Plains between the Platte and Arkansas valleys a strategic priority for the federal government. The Union needed the overland routes safe and open in order to keep New Mexico within its fold and to ensure that gold from the West would keep flowing east. This drew it on a collision course with the Cheyenne and Arapaho, who considered the Central Plains as their sovereign domain. They had every reason to do so. The formidable Comanches to the south viewed the Central Plains as a sovereign Cheyenne and Arapaho domain. And the United States itself had recognized Cheyenne and Arapaho sovereignty over 70,000 square miles in the 1851 Treaty of Fort Laramie. The confrontation with the Union soon posed an existential crisis for the Cheyenne and Arapaho. Not because the federal government was so strong in the West, but because it was so weak. In 1861, following a long neglect, federal presence in the plains was limited to a few military posts, which rendered the Union hold of the West alarmingly fragile. The Union lacked manpower to police the critical overland trails or to establish even a modicum of effective jurisdiction in the strategically critical Central Plains. And so it sought a military solution. It established new military garrisons across the region and mobilized troops against the nomadic tribes to pacify the critical Middle Belt. The federal Indian policy in the West was put in the hands of army commanders and thus militarized. Next image. A vast region stretching across the Central Plains into the Front Range became a war zone, a site of dozens of small fights and raids, as well as wholesale massacres. The conflict may have begun as a strategic Civil War campaign, but it soon became a war of conquest aimed at eliminating native sovereignty in the Central Plains. In 1861, already under intense military pressure, a minority of Cheyenne and Arapaho chiefs accepted a new reservation on the Arkansas River. It was less than a tenth of the size of the 1851 reservation. Yet, the federal government kept increasing the pressure, now targeting not only Cheyenne and Arapaho warriors, but also civilians and material resources, most destructively at Sand Creek and the Washita River. The last stand of the Cheyenne Dog Soldiers in 1869 marked the end of Cheyenne and Arapaho military resistance. Now, at that moment of military defeat, two long evolving structural conditions came to bear with disastrous consequences for the Cheyenne and Arapaho. One was the chronic weakness of the federal presence in the Great Plains. The other was Washington, D.C.'s distinctive understanding of indigenous sovereignty. The United States did not incorporate the Cheyenne and Arapaho into its political body in the Central Plains. It could not, because there was no United States in the Central Plains. Instead, the federal government simply eradicated or at least suspended Cheyenne and Arapaho sovereignty in the Central Plains to install its own sovereignty in its place. Now, this kind of simultaneous eradication and creation of sovereignty was, in 1869, a well-established policy. American views of indigenous sovereignty had been molded over several decades in the crucible of Indian removal, which both reaffirmed and narrowed it. Indian nations were seen as inherently sovereign nations within a much larger nation, recognized as such by the treaties they had made with the federal government. But at the same time, and crucially, native nations were also seen as unfit to survive on their own in the American federal system, and therefore had to become wards of the federal government. Indian removal had conditioned the Americans to see indigenous sovereignty as a malleable entity. It could be reduced, diluted, divided, suspended, transplanted, and yet somehow preserved. It could be given and therefore taken away. In the course of a few years after 1869, the federal agents did all those things to Cheyenne and Arapaho sovereignty. Next image. They suspended it and transplanted it from the Central Plains into Indian Territory, where supposedly it could be preserved against land-hungry white settlers. Then in 1871, Congress abolished the treaty system altogether in order to give the House of Representatives a say in Indian affairs. Thereafter, the federal government would recognize no independent native nations or powers. Instead of negotiation, it would deal with Indians through legislation. National wardship, which retained the notion of indigenous nationhood, was replaced by individual wardship, which did not. This shift was machinated by Congress, but it reflected a broader post-Civil War national mood. From reformers to government officials and politicians, almost every group with a hand in Indian affairs had grown impatient with the notion of indigenous nationhood, denouncing it as a legal relic that had no place in the reunited states. With the American racial crisis supposedly resolved with unbearable costs, the role of Native Americans in national life became a burning question. The United States would remain united only if it could create a truly national economy and culture of free labor, yeoman agriculture, and corporate capitalism. And so assimilation, first in the form of a grand peace policy, became the bedrock of US Indian policy. The consequences were immediate and immense. The struggle over indigenous sovereignty now shifted from the political to a cultural realm. The question now was not the viability of native nations in the United States, but the viability of Indianness itself within the Union. And so the federal assault on Cheyenne and Arapaho sovereignty extended from land to bodies and minds through food rationing, forced education programs, imposed social reforms, and religious indoctrination. By the mid-1870s, the Cheyenne and Arapaho had lost much of the key element of sovereignty, the power to assert control over events that take place on one's territory. We can already see the ingredients of the Dawes Act, the pinnacle of American Indian Reconstruction, falling in place. This was the reality of greater Reconstruction in Indian country. The federal government, impatient to make the mid-continent safe for agribusiness and settlement, kept molding and narrowing the notion of indigenous sovereignty. The Cheyenne and Arapaho case captures the vast capacity of the imperial nation state, to use Stephen Hahn's apt phrase, to determine the terms of belonging and the contours of sovereignty in North America. And this has become the dominant narrative of the Western Indians and the American Empire during the Civil War era. The American Leviathan rising, bulldozing native peoples out of its way through military might, massacres, and its malleable view of indigenous sovereignty. But this is not the whole story, and it may not even be the dominant story. The US imperial nation state was an unprecedented entity in the history of North America. Its colonial predecessors, whether British, French, or Spanish, had always been regional actors at best, their power stunted by distance, logistics, and indigenous borders and power. Yet, during and after the Civil War, the American Leviathan was still surprisingly weak in the West. There was no direct line leading from Appomattox to the Spanish-American War or the Philippine-American War. As of the 1860s and 70s, the history of the American West was still pulling in several directions, among which a continent-spanning national union was but one of many. And again, it was in the Great Plains where this dynamic was most nakedly visible. Indeed, for most Plains Indians, the expansion of the imperial nation-state was a distant threat. Take the Comanches, for example. Next image. For them, the most immediate threat from the late 1840s into the early 1860s was a deep and prolonged drought that devastated bison herds, caused widespread starvation, triggered a demographic catastrophe, and demolished the informal empire that in 1845 had boasted a hemispheric reach. The Comanches surrendered their raiding domains in northern Mexico, gave up tribute extraction in New Mexico, and witnessed their commercial pull to dissipate almost nothing. By the time of the Civil War erupted, Comanches were refugees in their own country. Texas had pushed its ranching economy deep into Comanche home territory, forcing the Comanches to retreat into the depths of Llano Estacado. And then, in 1865, two things happened. First, the drought passed. Then the Confederacy collapsed. And just like that, the Comanches returned. 6 months after Appomattox, they met with the U.S. Peace Commission and received a tantalizing proposal. If they allowed military forts on their lands, the United States would reaffirm their claims to more than 140,000 square miles. Now, 1/3 of that land nominally belonged to Texas, which had never acknowledged Indian claims within its unilaterally imposed borders. The federal government, in short, handed over Texas lands to buy peace from the Comanches. Federal reconstruction policies had a distinctly punitive streak in Texas, which generated a massive opening for the Comanches. With their core territory, Comancheria, secured by an anti-Texas Comanche-US treaty, Comanches mounted a dramatic comeback. As they had done in the early 19th century, they began to rearrange the Southwest after their own image, imposing their notions of borders and sovereignty on others. Image. Bolstering their numbers by incorporating large numbers of Kiowas, Cheyenne, and Arapahoes into their ranks, they began systematic raiding in the disarmed and exposed Texas, taking horses, cattle, and captives. And they used the spoils to reactivate their lapsed borderlands trade with New Mexico, where U.S. Army officers quietly invested in the clandestine traffic. Image. Exploiting the emancipation drive of the post-Civil War United States, Comanches kept stealing women and children from frontier settlements, and then handing them over to U.S. federal officers for handsome ransoms in cash and goods. Thus emboldened, Comanches expanded their raiding operations across a massive swath of land that extended from Bosque Redondo to Indian Territory and from the Smoky Hill River into northern Mexico. Image. By 1867, their sphere of influence extended 800 miles north to south and 500 miles east to west, creating an acute crisis of authority along the US-Mexico border and making a mockery of the United States' modernizing plans for the Southwest. Comanches were all over the place, seeking trade, plunder, and pastures, and expanding their jurisdiction through violent mobile action. Now, this was a particular kind of rule or jurisdiction. It did not extend to foreign territories. Rather, it focused on access to foreign resources, livestock, and captives, which in a sense took the place of landed property. Comanches, in short, saw the settler colonies around them as resource domains over which they held a kind of shifting on and off again jurisdiction. It was a dramatic resurgence made possible by the Reconstruction turmoil in Texas, but it was also a return to form. The Comanches had orchestrated a reconstruction of their own. They had been imperial once, and they would be imperial again. Image. In the fall of 1867, at Medicine Lodge Creek, Desperate to pacify the plains for railroad construction, the federal government made another proposition to the Comanches. In exchange for allowing a railroad along the Smoky Hill Valley, they would receive a small reservation in Indian Territory and the right to hunt in their traditional lands as long as there were enough buffalo to justify the chase. It was a typical US-Indian treaty, obscured by mutual misunderstandings and marred by conflicting understandings of sovereignty and ownership of land. US agents believed that by accepting the reservation, Comanches had given up their claims to the rest of their territory, over which they now only held a temporary hunting privilege. For Comanches, however, that the hunting privilege was ownership. Use and ownership of land were inexorably linked. And crucially, they believed that they could preserve the buffalo herds by relying on systematic cattle raiding, which would ease the pressure on the bison. They believed that they would hunt and rule the southern plains for generations to come. And then there were the newly imperial Lakotas. If the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1851 had launched the US ascendancy in the Central Plains, in the Northern Plains it helped to solidify a Lakota one. Image. Recent arrivals to the west, Lakotas had expanded explosively during the preceding 3 decades, dispossessing several indigenous nations. They claimed the Northern Plains by the right of conquest and adopted a distinctly territorial approach to space and belonging, seeking exclusive rights to prime bison ranges. In the 1851 Treaty Council, Lakotas already behaved like an imperial power, speaking for lesser tribes whom they saw as their junior allies, and forced the United States to recognize their sovereignty over the recently conquered lands. The upshot of the Fort Laramie Treaty was that the Lakota expansion would continue for a generation more alongside with the US one. Kinship politics, mobility, and social shape-shifting had sustained Lakota power for generations, and they continued to do so even as the United States introduced reservations, military forts, and total war into the equation. The Lakotas pulled the Northern Cheyenne and Arapaho and a number of their Eastern Sioux kin into a massive alliance that expanded in the Northern Plains through the 1850s and 60s. This last phase of Lakota expansion, grounded in both connectivity and territoriality, and increasingly imperial in form, displaced 3 nations, the Pawnee, the Crow, and the Blackfeet. It also delivered a rude awakening to the imperial nation state. Already struggling to keep the slave South in its fold, it now saw an indigenous empire challenging its claims for supreme sovereignty in the West. The critical pressure point was the Missouri Valley. Lakota power politics directly challenged American control of the Missouri River, the key to the Western fur trade and a jump-off point for major trails to the west, thus undermining the very prospect of a continent-spanning republic. Now that much is fairly easy to see. What requires more effort is to see how Lakotas continued to expand in the shadow of the American Leviathan, keeping it at arm's length while simultaneously harnessing its resources to fuel their own territorial conquests. The stage for continued Lakota expansion was set in a vicious 5-year war with the United States over the Bozeman Overland Trail that cut through the Lakota territory. The Lakotas won the war decisively and then expanded their land holdings in the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie that ended the war. Image. The establishment of the Great Sioux Reservation in the treaty did formalize state presence in Lakota lives and divided the Lakota nation into reservation and off-reservation factions. But more immediately, it brought access to crucial resources, rations, clothing, vaccines, and guns that buttressed Lakota dominance in the Northern Plains. Image. The Lakotas used the reservations as supply depots that sustained their nomadic existence on the open plains. They relied on a range of state-evading strategies: mobility, composite identities, and social fission, and dispersion into rugged terrain to not only avoid the power of the American state, but to actually expand in its midst. The Lakota Nation became a labyrinthine nexus of people and attachments that straddled reservation boundaries, preserving political autonomy within them and sustaining independent power politics without. This nexus was only partially visible to US agents, which made it so difficult to contain. Lakotas then had created a situation, a controlled chaos, that only them could understand and manage. Undergirding that situation, there was the flexible, almost opportunistic vision of sovereignty. By accepting government agencies in their lands, Lakotas had conceded to a restricted or pooled sovereignty over their territory. But this new sovereignty order was spatially minuscule, limited to the eastern southern borderlands, where all the government agencies were located. Moreover, the agencies never became the kinds of tools for cultural engineering the federal government intended. Instead, Lakotas incorporated the agencies into their traditional annual cycle as different kinds of river valleys, crucial enclaves that yielded resources, sustaining their numbers and power, and thus allowing them to maintain uncompromised territorial sovereignty over the vast northern plains. Relying on their superior mobility and ability to shapeshift, Lakotas resided deep in the high plains, emerging only to collect rations and guns at government agencies, to raid trespassing immigrants, and to defend their borders against putative US incursions. Protecting its sovereignty through a distinctly itinerant power politics, the Lakota Nation was expanding and hiding in plain sight, scoring decisive victories against several rival groups, including the US Army. In 1876, the Lakotas fully expected to defeat and demolish any enemy that invaded their homeland. And so they did. Thank you.
Well, our final speaker tonight is to comment, and this will be done by Professor Elliott West, who is an incredibly distinguished scholar, and frankly, I know personally, a very generous one. A couple of years ago, he came and participated in a workshop at Penn State for one of our advanced grad students and provided enormously helpful and generous critique to that individual. Professor West serves as Alumni Distinguished Professor of History at the University of Arkansas and is a specialist in the history of the American West and on environmental and Native American history. He is the author of 7 books, most recently The Last Indian War, The Nez Perce Story, and The Essential West, which I assume is not an autobiography. The Contested Plains, which was published in 1998, received 6 national awards, including the Penn West Award as the year's best nonfiction book and the Francis Parkman Prize as the outstanding book in American history. He has also served as past president of the Western History Association. But I think it's also characteristic of him that he is just a superb teacher, and I think we should recognize that. He has twice received the University of Arkansas's award as Teacher of the Year, and in 2009, he was one of 3 finalists for the Robert Foster Cherry Award for the outstanding classroom teacher in the nation. That's a great commitment. Anyway, I'd like for you to welcome to the podium Professor Elliott West.
Well, thank you, Bill, for the generous introduction. I'll add my thanks to Frank Tower for this wonderful conference and for the invitation to come to this fabulous place, and to all of you for being here. It's been a great day, a long day, so I'll try to keep this short and simple. Sovereignty. is one of those words like love and, for our current generation, awesome, that have taken on so many meanings that you wonder sometimes just how useful they can be. I think of such words as the linguistic equivalent of spandex, and each of us can bear witness as to just how much territory spandex can cover. These two fine papers got me thinking about how we might define the term a bit more clearly. And because both papers, thankfully, go beneath the abstractions of international law and the theoretical works of writers like Benedict Anderson to consider state-making on the ground, they had me thinking about sovereignty in its most basic and its earliest expressions. From that perspective, I found myself imagining sovereignty more as a process, more like a verb than a noun, a process of stages, each of them fluid and contested, and probably inevitably one that's violent. Pekka writes of an earlier stage in state-making than Erika does. In his story, sovereignty begins, at least, as the prize in a contest among independent peoples and societies. In this case, the young American Republic on the one hand, and on the other hand, those semi-nomadic native superpowers, the Lakotas and the Comanches. This is an elemental contest for control of geographical space. The space contested was the mid-continent, country from the southern Canadian plains on the north and to the deserts of northern Mexico on the south, and between roughly the 98th and the 110th meridians. Here, by the middle of the 19th century, two roughly allied collections of tribes, dominated by the Comanches to the south and the Lakotas of the western Sioux to the north, had created an allied empire larger than Western Europe. And here, after 1848, that empire, in turn, would be challenged by the other party, the United States, after its war with Mexico and the almost exactly coincident discovery of gold in California in 1848. Pekka writes about the dynamics of power between the two parties, with particular attention to, as he puts it, quote, the tangible workings of sovereignty and jurisdiction on the ground. He's already written brilliantly, of course, about the southern portion of that Indian empire, the Comanche country, and here he brings the Lakotas to the north more into the story, and that's where I'll keep most of my main focus. To the Lakotas and the Comanches, sovereignty came down to command of three fundamental resources. There were horses, the basic tools of military and economic strength, bison, the essential asset of subsistence, and most importantly, grass, as the forage and therefore the fuel, grass, that powered everything else. These resources were laid out not uniformly, but as a complex mosaic across the mid-continent. And for the Comanches and the Lakotas, the tangible sovereignty amounted to the command of these resources of horses, bison, and grass through a sophisticated, extraordinarily sophisticated choreography of use and manipulation, season by season, over tens of thousands of square miles, from today's Saskatchewan to Coahuila. Pekka's article in William and Mary Quarter, The Politics of Grass, tells his tale wonderfully. Before 1848, the United States, by contrast, had virtually no interest in the resources that were at the heart of native sovereignty. The Lakotas dominated what was called vaguely Indian country, the vast northwest corner of the nation. This is about 700,000 square miles, with no national presence, with no national interest, besides an abstract diplomatic claim. If official Washington had been asked before 1848 what sovereignty meant there, the answer would have been something like, who cares? For more than 25 years, this is fascinating, for more than 25 years in U.S. history, roughly 1820 to 1848, this country, which made up roughly 1/4 of the entire nation, was essentially a national irrelevance. That changed with the nation's expansion to the Pacific coast, 1845 to 48, and the discovery of California gold. Suddenly, Indian country was very relevant indeed. Suddenly, sovereignty, for the first time here, began to mean something real. It took two forms. The first looked farther ahead in the business of state-making. Sovereignty here now meant exercising some real authority over disparate peoples and specifically starting to absorb those people into a national community by remaking their very identity. Pekka rightfully considers the Laramie Treaty of 1851 as a critical point in this process, in the beginning of this process. Luke Lee, Commissioner of Indian Affairs, could not have been clearer in his goals for that treaty. Plains Indians, he wrote, quote, are entirely ignorant of their position in relation to the government. It is time they understood them. And he went on, it is our duty to civilize them so they will readily yield themselves to all the measures that the government may adopt for that purpose. So, clear authority and the power to define common cultural ground, which with the Indians came down to be farmers, be Christians, and send your kids to our schools. These together defined one of these two new meanings of tangible sovereignty in this country where it had not really existed before or was unconcerned before. And as such, they anticipate the next stage of state making, which anticipates, in turn, Erika's paper. But sovereignty in 1848 had a second and a much more immediate meaning to the nation. You can say it simply. Sovereignty was the power to control how and where people moved. Washington's most immediate need, most pressing need after 1848 was connectivity, especially after the far coast revealed itself as the most valuable place on earth. That was the most pressing reason that Washington suddenly paid attention to Indian country. It had to be sure that the Lakotas and the Comanches would stay out of the way so its people could move through that space on their essential errands of consolidating a new nation. This new continental nation, in this new continental nation, everything came down to access. But access and movement were also, of course, prime concerns of the Indian superpowers. Tangible sovereignty to them, to the Lakotas and the Comanches, came down to control of that intricate choreography, the command of who moved where and when in their vast interior empire, who had the freest access to those pasture lands and see as the seasons changed, who could occupy those prime winter enclaves when they were most needful, who could turn to the best bison grounds at the best time. That was the rub. The country simply could not accommodate these two very different regimes of movement. That was the crux of the clash of sovereignties between the two parties, beginning in 1848. In the 1850s and in the Civil War, whites and Indians in the area that we're talking about, whites and Indians did not fight over resources, although they would later. They did not fight over who would define identities and cultures, yet they would later. They did not fight even over who would occupy this geographical space, although they certainly would fight later about that. Every conflict during the 1850s and the Civil War, during those years, was about a conflict about movement, over who controlled the routes and the roads and the pathways that all sides understood were the key to commanding the country and using it as they envisioned. And everything that plays out later, I think, begins with this, the fascinating story that Pekka tells about the movement toward this attempt to redefine sovereignty in terms of these other things. Really starts with this. Pekka makes this point well, and he makes me wonder whether, when we pull back and when we look back at the coming into being of these three nations, these three very big nations, ranking second and third and 14th in area today among all the nations in the globe, maybe this is close to the nub of the earliest and most elemental sovereignty. Maybe sovereignty begins with the familiar call of the watchman in the night. Who goes there? And maybe whoever can answer that question wins. We might think about how that power remains important in the later stages of nation making. For instance, in establishing this next step of establishing common values and identity. It was key to controlling, after all, the two main culturally anomalous groups in these years in the United States. Indians would soon be told that they could not move from reservations until they conformed. Southern slaves were already being told that they could not move, period. We might look more broadly still to the remaking of sovereignty in the East and during Reconstruction, when Union victory dismantled that crucial power of the Confederate state. This had me remembering Eric Foner's fascinating point that many freed persons, upon being freed, felt that the essence of emancipation was not that they could simply go wherever they wanted, was that they could simply go wherever they wanted. Personal sovereignty, to them, was first and foremost the freedom to move. Well, bringing freed slaves into conversation with the Lakotas in considering sovereignty might be, I will admit, a stretch. But hey, spandex. Erika's paper regards Mexico during this later step in nation-making. The conflicts she considers are not ones of independent peoples and cultures, but conflicts within a polity that, however unstable and unfocused, had some collective existence. Mexico had borders, sort of. It had some common past and common memories, however conflicted and turbulent. It had an emerging set of political values, those suggested in the Constitution of 1857. It had had some encompassing institutions, notably the Roman Catholic Church. Those are foundation stones of a state, and those are the players in this stage of the evolution of sovereignty. Erika leads us through that other North American Civil War, and like Pekka, she is less concerned with abstractions. She, too, wants to know more about the realities on the ground. She wants to know what we see when we move down to watch that power, watch those with power feel their way toward those firmer structures that would characterize the three nations that would emerge later in the century. She wants to know how that muddled process was creating a new political reality, how, as she puts it, it established a new, quote, bond between government and the governed. That would be the new form of sovereignty. What I took away from this paper most of all was, first, a fuller appreciation of that perspective, of how things look when we get down into the dirty workings of nation-making. Specifically, I found it intriguing just how deeply conflicted were those supposedly unifying bonds of the sort that nation-makers always rely upon. Such is surely the case in the story of every nation, but just as surely it is more so in those states like our three in North America, nations that are not only among the largest in the world, but also among the most ethnically and culturally diverse. In Mexico, for instance, there was the unifying, if vague, principle of the rights of man, which had been something close to boilerplate in the basic charters of government since 1836, and which in 1857 included freedoms of expression, of assembly, of petition, of bearing arms, and, interestingly, the freedom of movement. But in the particular enforcement of those freedoms, the Constitution allowed courts to invalidate an administrative act or law it ruled in violation of those rights, but only in the particular case before it. The Constitution, that is, backhandedly recognized tensions within those ideals by building in a virtual guarantee that the overarching freedoms would translate into a vast hodgepodge of specific meanings across the nation. The Roman Catholic Church, Erika reminds us, represented in her words a web of norms and institutions that in many ways was more substantial than the state. And indeed, before 1857, the church had been explicitly wedded to the nation itself. But when things got particular again, this unifying institution conflicted with those equally unifying, all-embracing political visions. Political officials, before the political and religious had joined in a national ritual of bestowing state power. political officials would kneel before a crucifix and, with hands on the Gospels, would swear to uphold the Constitution. But then, when the Constitution did not specifically declare Mexico a Catholic republic, the Church, in turn, declared the Constitution as atheistic, ungodly, and unjust, and said it would excommunicate anyone who followed that traditional unifying ritual. Thus, those two rare grounds of common allegiance, the deeply rooted Catholic faith and the more recent but widely embraced vision of human rights, were pried apart. In practical, on-the-ground realities, this meant that a man who considered himself both a good Catholic among a nation full of them and a good citizen of a nation committed to particular secular beliefs, that man now had to choose. He could worship as he believed he should while turning away from political service, or he could keep his political commitments, be denied communion, never marry in the eyes of God, and get busy raising a house full of bastards. What Erika's paper stresses to me is that when we pass through Pekka's initial stage of state making and into one that is based on unifying diverse peoples, that is anticipated at the time that he's talking about, of finding the common in community, it is a process as contentious as the one before it. It's a fascinating conundrum, back there at that early elemental level of sovereignty as a verb. What seem to be, and what are, the most reliable sources of unity turn out also to be the most likely and the most dangerous points of fracture. Together, these two papers show us sovereignty as an evolving, moving target. And at this keynote session, they encourage me to think keystone thoughts and to wonder whether and how these much more general points might be found to apply to the other papers we have heard today and will hear tomorrow over these next days as we consider how North American sovereignty has been made and remade again and again. Thank you.
Well, if you're up for it, we can at least take a few. Yeah. Frank, should I unwind this thing and have it on the table?
Let's talk to our filmmakers.
Yes, wherever they're going to be, yeah.
We're going to be right here, okay? So please feel free to start firing away.
Question for Erika in the light of what Pekka had to say, and in the light of the way that Brian DeLay and others have shown how important Indian people, Indigenous people were to the Mexican Republic during the time when the United States invaded. Where does that issue go at the time that you're talking about? What has happened to that problem by the time that the seemingly very different agenda that you've talked about as opposed to what Pekka has talked about, or different stage, to use Elliott's terms, is taking place? What you talked about, what Pekka talked about, contemporaneous, but seemingly very divergent, and yet not that far, at least one little I know, of the northern Mexican past, the issues that interested Pekka were salient indeed. Could you somehow comment on that?
Well, one of the things I think makes it difficult, and on the other side it's very provocative, is the idea of these alternative sovereignties in Indian peoples in a country where most of the citizens are Indian. And we saw in Marcela Terrazas's presentation this morning how the idea that they're all citizens because they're all they all live on the territory, but even if they wanted to, they wouldn't be allowed to in the case of those called savage Indians. So I think that the 1857 Constitution, and Lola Ballesteros will talk about this tomorrow if I'm not mistaken, the idea is still that the thought of the savage Indians is suppressed, except in the case of those delegates from the north who are actually trying, well, legalizing the union of Nuevo León and Coahuila, and part of the reason that they're doing that is that they, it needs to be a larger territory so that they can get rid, combat, etc. The nomadic groups, and the fiction of the so-called Indians and the so-called naturals having disappeared under the clothing of the citizen.
I wanted to ask a question about starting points and ending, or I guess periodization is a fancy word about that, right? But, the way this is marked out in the conference is the idea of the Civil War, at least the 1860s, is a kind of remaking of sovereignty. So I guess I'm curious as to your explanations for sort of why you begin your stories where you begin and why you end when they end, and the most, and to what extent that was actually a conscious decision or not. I guess this came to mind at the very end of your talk, Pekka, where we end in 1876 and greasy grass and the famous depiction of, the bluecoats falling down into the, well, I don't know if they're falling down into, but they're, the Lakota Empire is victorious, and, that's the image we get in 1876. But if we ended the story a decade later,
Or just a year later.
or just I want to be nice about it.
No need to.
The story would have a very different soundtrack to it. So,
Well, that's the whole point.
Okay.
I mean, I just want to get sort of avoid that teleological reading of this history. I mean, yeah, I started with the Louisiana Purchase because that's sort of when the Americans start, especially with the Lewis and Clark, they start to assert sovereignty over this region, but it's just fiction, obviously. So so that's the start point, and the ending point is exactly the year before the final defeat. But that's I chose that for obviously for narrative purposes, but also because that captures how Lakotas viewed. I mean, they still in 1876 they thought they're gonna rule this world. They're gonna rule the Black Hills for decades to come, but when the army unleashed total war in the next year, it was all over. I mean, and Buffalo were gone, but there's still hope. Because there was still kind of viable buffalo herds, little pockets of bison, in further north. So there was hope, and I believe the Lakotas believed, they still had a chance. So I wanted to leave that sort of linger there.
Erika, did you want to answer that?
No.
Okay.
I have a very mundane question. I'm trying to get a sense of scope and scale for violence. And I went and looked for the Reform War to see how many deaths there were, just as we think about Civil War. And I went to Wikipedia, of course, because that's most reliable. And they say there's 250 deaths on one side and 88 on the other, which I know can't be true. But I had a difficult time finding another answer. So I guess the question for both of you is, what percentage of the population of the peoples that you're looking at are engaged in the conflicts that you're looking at? How can we get a sense of the scope and scale of the levels of violence that is coming about in this period of state transformation?
Well, in my case, if you look at these, indigenous groups, every single one, in these groups is involved in the violence. So, we are talking about Lakotas, 15, 20,000 people. Every single one, when war breaks out, is involved. It's total experience. You don't have, combatants and non-combatants, combatants. Everybody's involved. So, I mean, on the plains, we are looking at, I don't know, 50, 60, 70,000 people,
Total.
Yeah, and deeply involved in these conflicts over access and over mobility, who can go where.
This is such a bad question for me because I really have no idea. When I say it is the most violent civil war in a century of civil wars after independence, it's because it becomes terribly unforgiving war. After, you know, decades of these almost ritualistic pronunciamientos where, you know, how many are on your side? Oh, they're more than on my side, so I guess you win. When opposition politicians usually go into exile and are not executed after, you know, the Iturbide and Guerrero executions, the Reforma War sees a lot of executions at Salazar, the Tacubaya massacres. So how many people died? I wouldn't be able to even tell you
I searched
something
around in
close
other
to
sources
it.
and found no number anywhere.
But the French army, it ends up putting 30,000 soldiers in Mexico. And it is said that between Escobedo during the siege of Querétaro and Diaz, who takes Puebla and then takes Mexico City, there's about 80,000. So, which were obviously not there when the French arrived in 1862. No? So I think that gives us an idea of the scale, but I think that more the fact that there really is a culture of violence and of extermination, I think, is notable, and but I wouldn't even know where to look, but I need to figure it out.
Frank?
Question for Erika. This is partly to just have you elaborate more on what to me is sort of the central theme of the presentation, but also to pose a question about the second stage that Elliott was talking about. When you try to form these cultures, what's happening is, as I understand things, there is a kind of limitation of the state here because they just cannot come to a way to reconcile these two opposing forces. There's such extreme views that it can't hold together. Is that caused by things that are fundamentally social and cultural? That is, maybe the deep-seatedness of Catholic conservatives in yielding no ground whatsoever? Or is this a problem in the way that not just Mexico, but the emerging concept of the Westphalian nation-state itself is conceived? That trying to seek that kind of maximal sovereignty is an inherently impossible project. So is it coming from the structure of what they're pursuing, or from deep social and cultural differences that are specifically in Mexico?
I wouldn't say it's deep cultural, and there are deep cultural differences that are not the fault lines. You have very diverse populations on both sides, and this is not the issue. I think the issue is, at this moment, inherently political, and I think that for the liberals, it's something that they can get away with, that there is enough it should be, magnetic enough so that for the church it's clearly an issue of authority, and for the conservatives and for those who are going to become Catholics, who are going to stop being conservatives and become politically Catholic, this is a social revolution. This is taking away that which brings the nation together, which is Catholicism. So I would say it's a different way of looking at, of conceiving what makes you part of the same community. And I think just in terms of what is right, what is moral, what should be done, when the Catholics say, when the liberals say this has nothing to do, well, this doesn't necessarily have anything to do with Catholicism, and it has nothing to do with the church. That's for the conservatives, that kind of takes the bottom things out.
Mark?
Okay, this is a question that relates to Puritization and to the links between what's going on in the West and the Civil War. I've often heard, I think it's part of your presentation, but I've heard it other ways, that we have to rethink the Civil War. We have to rethink this whole period from the Mexican War to the end of Reconstruction to bring in the story of the West. But isn't the larger picture that ever since initial settlement, both in Virginia and in the Puritan colonies, that there's been just a steady pattern of pushing back Native people, so that, if you were to look at, the imperial wars of the 18th century, or the American Revolution, which leads to such devastating losses by the Iroquois, or the events leading up to and including the War of 1812, that the region may change and some of the lines of communication may change. But there's really the larger continuity as European-American expansion goes on steadily. Wherever it is, there's pushing back. So in this period as settlement expands, you have a continuation, but it's not really tightly or causally connected to the Civil War. And so it's a broader continuity rather than a need to rethink Civil War and Reconstruction.
Well, sure. There's a constant pressure. Obviously, for colonial pressure from the early 1600s on, and you can see this as a sort of 4 century long process. That's continuous. But if you take a sort of a Western view into this, it's there's no continuity. I mean, American presence begins in Trans-Mississippi West, after Louisiana Purchase, but it takes, it doesn't get violent until, say, truly violent until 60 years later, and that's a huge sort of a time lag over there. And what triggers this is, struggles over access and mobility, but those struggles become intensified and extremely violent when the Civil War breaks out. So I think it's a major, it's a game changer, definitely in American West. If you take that sort of regional rather than continental approach, you see the Civil War as a major turning point for indigenous peoples.
Very concretely and briefly, I want to ask Erika. I can't resist asking her. So, what is the upshot of the political legacy of Juárez's victory in all of this, in the sense that, on the one hand, you can see it as the triumph of liberalism over monarchism, but on the other hand, Juárez, in the process of this incredible struggle, ended up dealing with all of these regional strongmen. He himself became a very, very authoritarian kind of guy, and maybe if he hadn't died, he would have ended up as a Porfirio Diaz, but he died, and one of these strongmen. So anyway, that's one question. And for Pekka, I just had a brief question as well. I was very fascinated by the brief mention you make about the Comanche retrenchment in these middle decades because of environmental factors. And then when you told the story about the Lakota, you didn't. So I guess the question is, was the Lakota's resurgence and ultimate defeat related to any environmental factors occurring in the 1870s? So.
Well, just briefly, with Lakotas, it's all the expansion, and the 20-30 year expansion of the Lakota regime is driven by ecological factors. They're really trying to maximize and protect their hunting grounds, because the buffalo are declining from the 1850s on. It has to do with overhunting, for American fur trade and markets, but it also has to do with drought and changing ecological conditions, and also disturbance from overland travel and later on from railroads. So it's more or less ecologically driven expansion, in the Lakota case. Yeah.
This is actually a very good question, and one that I ask myself every night before I go to sleep. It's the graduate student's nightmare. No, oh, this is all very interesting. So what? I think here, I've been thinking about it a lot. I don't think I have the final answer, and thinking about the end of the U.S. Civil War, I think, helps us kind of put things into perspective. The fact that the constitutional government comes out of the war as the owner of law, in a sense that it is almost above it, no? it can obey the Constitution when it is convenient. The president doesn't have to change, because it's the middle of the war, so it can apply the law when it wants to, but it doesn't necessarily. There are amnesty laws afterwards, but it doesn't necessarily say these laws are wrong, in the way that the U.S. Supreme Court, decided that loyalty oaths were unconstitutional. That even though ex parte Vallandigham is how you pronounce him, said, that civilians could be subject to military tribunals, but then afterwards the Supreme Court says no. If there are civil tribunals, then the civilians have to be subject to those courts. I do think that it fosters an attitude towards the law that is embodied by this probably apocryphal saying of Juarez, which is, "To my friends, justice and grace; for my enemies, the law." So this idea that the law is more than this thing that orders all of society is something that you use selectively to do certain things to certain people. But I might be exaggerating.
Well, we actually have hit just about the end of our published time. Thank you for a great session and a great job.